You ever heard the term the good old days? Ah, yes. For an old guy like myself, sometimes it's good to harken back on some of my childhood, teens, even young adulthood when it comes to music, movies, maybe the way cars were built back then, technology. Well, maybe not technology, but you know where I'm coming from. And the same can be said for sports. Because when I think about the good old days, I think about what baseball was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s prior to the 94 strike. And then, of course, you have the NBA, where a lot of people are going to look at the days of Magic, Bird, and even Jordan as the heyday of the NBA, where now it's too many three-point shooting and ISOs and just bore you to tears. You could also attribute the good old days to hockey, the NHL, where when we think about the 70s, 80s, and 90s, how physical it was, how rough and tough, going into buildings like the old Joe Louis Arena or the Spectrum, which was a haunted house for a lot of visiting teams, especially when you had to go up against the Broad Street Bullies. And not even the Broad Street Bullies of the 70s, I'm talking about the ones in the 80s, where you had Dave Brown, Darryl Stanley, Rick Tocchet, guys like that, which patrolled the ice and certainly put fear into the opponents and had that home ice advantage, whether it be in the regular season or even in the postseason. Well, that's what I want to talk about, the postseason, because there was an incident that took place to the day, 39 years ago, which changed the NHL forever. And I understand a lot of the historians and a lot of people who followed hockey and loved hockey back then would look at that as a black eye to the sport. But really, in my eyes, it became a black eye to the sport after the fact because of what took place, not even during the game, where Game 6 of a playoff up in Montreal between the aforementioned Flyers and the Montreal Canadiens took place. It's what happened before that changed the history of the NHL from that day moving forward. May 14th, 1987. I was a senior in high school, and the NHL was literally 1A to baseball when it comes to my favorite sport. I mean, think about it. The NFL, yeah, it was up and running. You had the Niners of the 80s there, claiming that decade. And even with the NBA being at their heyday with Magic and Bird during that time, and this was right before Jordan ascended to take the league over by storm. But it was the NHL, which I loved and admired, and especially when it came to the postseason, because it was always an inch of ice which couldn't be patrolled without getting hit, without getting punched, and dare I say, it was competitive hockey at its finest. Not to say it's not the case today, but it is a far cry from what it once was. Just like I mentioned, the good old days. But when it comes down to what happened that night, and it was a Game 6 where the Flyers needed one win in order for them to punch their ticket to play the Edmonton Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals that year. And mind you, just 2 years prior to that, they did play in the Stanley Cup Final where the Edmonton Oilers had won. So it looked like there was a rematch on the horizon, but the Flyers had one more game to win. But it wasn't even just about winning a game. It was also about winning that battle on the ice, but before the game. Just bear with me as I explain this. During pregame warm-ups, generally the Canadiens had a player or two go onto the ice to put the puck in the opposing team's net. Now, mind you, this was when, after all the players had gone into the locker room to unwind, refresh, and get ready for game time puck drop about 20 minutes after that. And for whatever the reason, 2 nights prior to that, where the Canadiens, whether it be Shane Corson and or Claude Lemieux, would go onto the ice and hit the puck right into the opposing team's net, went over to the locker room as if nothing happened. But on this night, the Flyers weren't going to be able to tolerate it anymore, because what took place was Shane Corson coming out, taking a shot into the opposing team's net, which, let's face it, it's not really cool, and I'm sure they probably thought that everybody was in the locker room and nobody was watching. But on this fateful night, there were 2 players that did, which I'll get to in a moment. But you got to understand something. It is gamesmanship. It's similar to an NBA player scoring a basket when it's 114-89 and there's 5 seconds left, instead of dribbling out the clock, just laying it off the glass or even dunking it in, as we saw earlier this postseason with Jaden McDaniels doing that against the Denver Nuggets, which is, let's face it, it's a code for being approached. And if it was hockey, there would have been gloves dropped, etc. But because it's the NBA, you're going to have Nikola Jokic go into the face of that player, and a melee will ensue, not to the extent of where you're going to have a bench-clearing brawl or ejections, but that is the principle. But mind you, that incident that took place in that playoff game was in the game. This was before the game. So therefore, you had Ed Hospodar, another resident tough guy, when you think about it, the Flyers had about 6 tough guys on the ice that night, which I'll get to in a moment. But Ed Hospodar took umbrage. He said, I'm tired of this. So he sees Shane Corson put the puck in the net, and Shane Corson is a guy that wouldn't take a backseat to anybody as far as tough guys go. But Claude Lemieux, who in his day has had some fights and has been around controversy, more so with the Colorado Avalanche, a little less than a decade after that. But he was a guy that would mix it up every now and again, but certainly wouldn't go after any guy that was bigger than him or had a reputation for being a heavyweight tough guy in the league. But Ed Hospodar took matters into his own hands, literally. What he did was he skated onto the ice, he and Chico Resch, the backup goaltender of the Flyers, and what did Hospodar promptly do? Skated over to Corson because he figured, hey, I'm going to pick on somebody my own size. But then Claude Lemieux was the one that got the stray, as Hospodar went after him and started pounding him into submission. Where Lemieux, like I said, wasn't going to fight back. He turtled, which is a definition for just pretty much acting like a turtle to avoid getting hit. And what ensued after that became the beginning of something that, let's face it, I don't think we had seen in quite some time. And mind you, there have been plenty of bench clearing brawls over the years in the NHL. I mean, there's plenty of them. In the playoffs just a few years prior, you had the Good Friday Massacre, where the Montreal Canadiens against the Quebec Nordiques, the hated rivals in that province, went at it, not only at the end of the second period, but even came out at the start of the third period and continued their brawl. Now, you can thank Louis Slager for that with his cheap shot on Jean Hamel, which precipitated the second part of the brawl to start off the third period. But there have been many different instances throughout the course of time. And here it was on this night where the game was still about 20-25 minutes from beginning. This was the beginning of the end for the NHL and the rules and everything else, which, even almost 40 years later, I have to swallow and comprehend because this changed the game forever. I'll get to that, but with this incident that's now starting to brew and starting to take place, where Hospodar, as I mentioned, just beating up on Claude Lemieux, and then you have a situation where players are still in the locker room. Players are not even dressed to where now they're starting to come on the ice. And one guy in particular for the Philadelphia Flyers was Dave Brown, number 21. Dave Brown, for his era, was one of the most feared tough guys in the league. Not only was he 6'5", without skates, so imagine with skates, he was about 6'8", 6'9", weighed 225 pounds, and was one of the more dominant lefty fighters in the sport, where you pretty much had a lot of guys that threw right-handed, or the very few that switched and threw lefty and righty. This was a guy that had a jackhammer for a left hand. And of course, with his imposing size, it doesn't matter whether he was out there fully clothed, half naked, whatever, he was still gonna be a menace. So as he gets out there and he kind of surveys and sees what's happening, and Chris Nyland, the resident tough guy on the Montreal Canadiens, was out there, and that was just a beeline for Nyland to go poke his nose to see what's happening. And lo and behold, what took place? A big giant scrum, where now you had Brown and Nyland go at it, and you had a bunch of players converge on the ice where they were even sectioned off. But it all seemed like one big giant swarm of black and orange, as well as red, white, and blue, the colors of the Flyers and the Canadiens, where now this was just one big giant melee. A melee that, of course, prior to the internet and prior to Twitter and all that, we didn't get a chance to watch until after the game, whether it was the news highlights or maybe even ESPN. But in the internet era, if this would have happened today, geez, this would have been the biggest story in sports. Think about it. It's a playoff game prior to a game-clinching potential for the Flyers to advance to get to a Stanley Cup final, and now you have this Donnybrook that we have never seen in the likes of the NHL ever. So now you have the situation where Brown and Nyland are going at it, and Brown is sucking wind because when you watch these guys fight, especially two big, giant, tough guys like that, after 30 seconds, you're already winded. Think about it. You're on skates, you're trying to wail away at your opponent, and after grabbing and clutching and holding and swinging and balancing, I mean, geez, even the most conditioned athlete on the planet will be gassed after not even a minute. So here they were, going at it back and forth, nonstop. Then you see other scrums take place where Don Knockbauer is going at it with Larry Robinson. Yes, that Larry Robinson, who was a famed coach later on, but one of the all-time great defensemen. And it's interesting. Many years ago, I had Darryl Stanley on my podcast talk about this incident. And it was actually funny with what Darryl Stanley had to say, where Don Knockbauer, who was another tough guy on the Flyers, and Larry Robinson, who's one of the all-time great defensemen, they were grappling, going at it, and what he had to say about that, I thought was hilarious.
Donnie Knockbauer, I think, got into it with Larry Robinson, and you know, Larry at that time was, you know, he was one of the older guys on Montreal, and I'll tell you, tougher than hell, you know, hell of a hockey player and an idol, and I think him and Snack were kind of getting into it, and Snack might have hit him one, and I heard Larry yell out, "Enough of this shit, I'm too old for this shit." So,
and Darryl Stanley was a guy who was a defenseman and also a right winger who played on that Flyer team to throw his weight around. And one more time, people, all of the tough guys that were in the lineup that night, and I understand it was warm-ups, maybe there were some players that were scratched, but as I mentioned before, Dave Brown, Darryl Stanley, Rick Tocchet, Don Knockbauer. You also had other guys who weren't really fighters, but Ron and Rich Sutter, they were brothers that would like to scrap every now and again. You had those guys go at it. And to think, those four guys, without the Sutter brothers, those were guys that would fight with anybody. Whether you were a heavyweight, middleweight, lightweight, didn't matter. And I know off the top of my head, I'm probably missing a couple, but even on the Canadian side, you had Chris Nyland, you had Shane Corson, John Kordick, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, and you had another few other players on that team. Sergio Momesso was a guy that would mix it up every now and again. I mean, you couldn't even fathom the amount of tough guys on the ice at the same time, where if this was today, 2026, you'd be lucky if you have 10 tough guys in the league that are of that ilk to those aforementioned guys. So with that being said, now you have a scenario where Rick Tocchet, Mike McPhee, they're not going at it, but they're back and forth, yapping in each other's mugs. Then you had another fracas that was off to the side where Darryl Stanley and John Kordick were going at it, and John Kordick was a vicious lefty, a guy similar to Dave Brown where he only threw left-handed, but it was a situation where he was a lot smaller but a lot stockier, but a guy that would go at anyone. Just think about his classic fights with Jay Miller. That's all you need to know. Look that up on YouTube. But when you have a scenario where now you have Kordick and Stanley going at it, you have Brown and Nyland, you didn't really have much as far as other big-time tough guys going at it. I know I mentioned Knockbauer, although had a reputation, but he wasn't one of the game's toughest guys. Where when you talk about Chris Nyland, who's in the top 10 in penalty minutes all time, and Dave Brown, again, a feared guy of his era. Rick Tocchet was one who fought everybody during his era. John Kordick, another feared tough guy. As a hockey fight fan, you were in heaven. I mean, you couldn't get any better than this. But then, as it started to quiet down a little bit, and even though you see a lot of people pushing and shoving, and guys meandering throughout the ice, and of course, cooler heads have prevailed, Dave Brown, again, without a shirt, just suspenders holding up his pants, and Darryl Stanley pretty much the same, as his shirt was torn in his fight with John Kordick. And even though tempers cooled and things started to become a little bit normal, all in all, this was about 10 minutes that this took place, from the time that Hospodar went out to the ice to fight Lemieux until players started to go off into their respective locker rooms. And the crazy thing about this is that none of these players were suspended for the game. Although Ed Hospodar did get suspended for the rest of the postseason, considering that the Flyers went on to play in a Stanley Cup. So he was suspended for those 7 games that they lost to the Edmonton Oilers in that Cup final series. But other than that, no players were ejected. No players were tossed. It wasn't a situation where this was happening in the middle of a game. This was prior to, as I mentioned, and again, as I think about it to this very second, it's almost unfathomable to think that something like this could happen prior to the start of a game. We've seen brawls happen in the game. We've even seen it after the final buzzer sounds. I actually saw a brawl between the Philadelphia Flyers and the New Jersey Devils, where Ron Hextall was pummeling Alain Chevrier. There, while I was about 10 rows away from the ice. I was there that night when that happened. But before an actual game, we haven't seen it. And sadly, we haven't seen it since, which I'll get to momentarily. So now you had a situation where the players were coming down from this, and the Flyers, like I said, 1 game away from going to a Stanley Cup final, in which they clinched that night. They won up in Montreal. They punched their ticket to a Stanley Cup final, and as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, lost to the Edmonton Oilers for the second time in 3 years. But now, let's cut to even more the reason why I'm producing this video. The after effect of this. Yes, we know Hospital got suspended. The rest of that playoff, 7 games, came back the next year, I believe, in the 87-88 season. But now there had to be some rules implemented because, again, the NHL hadn't seen anything like this. Everybody's talking about, oh, it's a black eye. Oh, it's terrible for the sport. Oh, I can't believe it. Now we got to do something to change the outlook to avoid having these bench clearing brawls and have situations where players are just going to run amok and it's just going to be ugly and it's not going to look good for our sport. Now, prior to the 86-87 season, they implemented the instigator rule, which means whoever instigated a fight will get a 2-minute minor, which would set up a power play for the other team in their efforts to try to curtail fighting to slow it down, maybe not stop it altogether. But unfortunately, the NHL was successful in that regard. So it was a situation as time went on, if you got a 2-minute instigator and a 5-minute for fighting, I believe you also get a 10-minute misconduct, maybe even a game misconduct for all I know. That's how much I've stopped watching hockey to that regard, because to me, when I saw physical play, when I saw intimidating play, when I saw players go into buildings, as I mentioned, the Spectrum at that time, that was literally a house of horrors. Teams already had lost going into that building, knowing that they had to go through those tough guys in order for them to get any respect or any inch of that ice in order for them to win a game, let alone win a playoff series. But as it was, with the way the rules came out, now you had a situation where the first player off the bench is going to get a 10-game suspension. And the second player off that bench is going to get a 5-game suspension. With the coaches and front office, they're going to get fined $100,000. So the league had to come up with stiff, harsh penalties in order to ban the bench clearing brawl. And to me, the bench clearing brawl was a part of hockey. I understand sports evolves. You're not going to see the games of the 70s in the NFL with the hard hitting and the no calls and maybe not even a whistle, to where with CTE and concussions that they have to monitor it and get to a point where they have to implement all these rules in order for it to curtail and not have it be a violent game. And even with the NHL, with the bench clearing brawl, having a 10-game suspension for the first guy off the bench and 5 for the next guy to come out, and then fines and this and that, and all these different changes, which really, let's face it, in my eyes, damage the sport. Fighting is a part of hockey. Well, it still is today, but not like it once was. Because you don't have the resident tough guy. You don't have the resident tough guys, the 2, 3, 4, 5 guys that I mentioned there on the Flyers that year. And I understand it's 40 years ago, or almost 40, and the game is going to change. The game is going to wean out what I call the endangered species of the enforcer, which is sad, because when you look at what happened in the previous round in this playoff series, where Charlie McAvoy took a swipe at somebody, because McAvoy is going to drop the gloves and fight, nor does he have to worry about any retribution from the Dave Browns, the Chris Nylans, the John Cordicks, the Darryl Stanleys that are out there to know that that guy's going to get pummeled if he swung his stick. And I understand, all right, you're going to take away the bench clearing brawl. All right, fine. But do you have to get rid of fighting altogether? Because when you have stick swinging incidents and when you have spearing incidents and sucker punches and things of that nature, there isn't a guy to police that on any team. And it's just a very chosen few that are out there. The Ryan Reeves, the Matthew Oliviers, the Nicolas Deloriers, those guys, Matt Rempe, those guys are few and far between. And when you can pretty much do whatever you want without facing any type of retribution, it's easy to try to take your stick like a baseball bat and swing it at somebody, which is deplorable and disgraceful. I'd rather have them just drop the gloves, fight it out, and that's it. But the bench clearing brawl, there's something about the bench clearing brawl that just made you know that something could happen at any given night. And yes, is it not pretty? Or for someone that hates fighting altogether? I get it. But you know what? There was a level of anticipation when you knew that if the game was going to get out of hand, or whether you knew that it was a situation where the score was lopsided and the team wants to send a message. I know the message is what's on the scoreboard as opposed to who's going to get beat up there. But you know what? In a playoff series, that's going to stay at the forefront of your mind, to know that, if we're going to play this team another go around, we're going to have to watch out and watch our backs as to who's out there. If that means that the bench is going to clear, so be it. So to think that 39 years ago tonight, the last great bench clearing brawl that the NHL has ever seen and probably will ever see took place, to where they changed the rules. And let's face it, changed the NHL forever. Because that was the gauntlet. That was the watershed moment that the league, the come to Jesus moment, to say that if there's going to be any way that over time, whether it takes years or even decades, to slow down the pace of fighting in the league, this was the night that they did it. And I tell you, to me, it's all for the worse, not for the better. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the young hockey fan or even the older hockey fan, which may be on my side. But when I think about that night, and even though the turn of events for a fight fan like myself, it is going to leave that taste in your mouth that, what the good old days once were, at least I have that to look back on. Because I know for damn sure, to have an incident like that in the NHL today, I might as well play the lotto from here on out, because I have a better chance of hitting the jackpot than ever watching a bench clearing brawl again. Thank you so much for watching and stopping by the channel. If you could please support it by hitting that subscribe button, I'd appreciate it. Here's another video that I think you may like, which takes you back to the old days, which will bring up some good memories, maybe not so good memories, but nevertheless, it's entertaining, it's informative, and I hope you get to enjoy it. Until the next one, on the flip.